Morphternoon folks, Mark here, and welcome to the sofa. Let's also welcome back this chunky little firehawk. He's pretty scratched up from battle, but his story isn't over yet. It's time to abandon this poor guy to the warp. Abandoning him to the warp means going back to Blender first, unfortunately. When the Firehawks were stranded in the warp, they slowly got killed off. Par for the course when you're basically stranded in psychic hell. The survivors ended up as black armoured warriors, wreathed in flames and decorated with symbols of death, who were really determined to take it out on the Emperor's enemies. The way I pictured it, this wasn't arts and crafts hour where they painted their armour black and drew pictures of bones on. In the spirit of grimdark and upcycling, Brother Yorick here is going to use the bones of his fallen comrades to decorate his armour. I built a skeleton in Blender a while ago for just this kind of thing, so I could import parts of that and adapt them to fit pretty quickly. Most of the adjustments were just adding bolts and other fittings to keep the bones in place, all of which could then be sent to the printer. Obviously, the prints needed cleaning and refining, so that was the next step. A few bits broke getting them off the supports, mostly because I printed them a little thin, but it wasn't too bad. Then I could shave back the support nubs and file the layered lines down a little, which was great for the shoulder trim and spine, but the skulls were going to need some extra work. They were really fragile at the back, so I layered up some resin and put them in the sun for a while to support the interiors. That gave me the lazy idea to thinly coat the outer surface with resin too, covering up the layer lines without thinning it even more. More sunlight left me with a load of bone parts that needed a little bit of hacking about, just like the armour. Not as much damage though, since they were fitted to it later on. Which finally led me back to painting. I started with a quick airbrush of primer, black, then brown, and a touch of flesh tone to finish off. I always add flesh tone into my bone, roughly in the mid-tones. It just lends a more organic look. Then I could finish that with some paler colours to get them to look more bone-like. The metals were basically the same as the dents in the armour. I just used a less blue tone for the final highlight, mostly because I couldn't find the blue that I needed. Then I realised I probably needed to stop handling him. Now he had bone parts stuck all over him. He was getting kind of fragile. I was gonna start rubbing paint off. So the next thing to do was to drill a hole in the bottom of him, epoxy in a brass rod, drill a matching hole in the plinth I'd made, which I'd already sprayed black and then varnished, and then drop him and break the skull. Yeah, that was totally in the plan. Yeah. After a bit of a fix, he was back on his plinth, glued together, and I could carry on. Now he just needed to burn. Okay, painters of a nervous disposition may wish to look away now, because the next thing I had to do was stipple black all over the stuff I'd spent so long painting. I also used yellow, purple and blue inks on the metals just to give them a bit of a tarnished, heat-bloomed look. There was no sense in them being clean when everything else had been burned. You know what? I thought this would be easier to watch back, but it really isn't. Bye-bye, freehand. I'd been hoping to keep more of the freehand visible, but honestly, the longer I stippled for, the more I realised in order to get him to look black, I was going to have to pretty much cover all of it. I actually found that black as a base coat, with that super black Black 3.0 as a shade, and black with a tiny hint of grey as a highlight worked really well to give a nice mottled, sooty look. That's sooty as in fire, not sooty the hand puppet. Then it was on to the flames as the last part. That meant I started with clear, then used a dilute mix of orange and pink fluorescent in texture gel to generate a more transparent flame. Transparent? Translucent? Trans something. Anyway. As ever, I sculpted the flames with just any old sculpting tool to blob rough shapes on, and then a damp brush to try and smooth it out into actual flame shapes. Partway through I realised I hadn't actually painted the eyes, so I had to go back and do those. I went for the undamaged eye being quite a sort of glowing dull orange, and the damaged eye I kept very dark as if the light had gone out behind it. Then it was a case of building up the flames with more layers to increase the size and refine the shapes, trying to ignore the fact that I hadn't planned for how much thicker the flames would be on the model than on the test. So what was supposed to be fairly see-through was actually catching the light and turning into a kind of neon orange blob. I just had to keep moving and, like usual, hope I didn't screw it up even more in the process. The later layers were thinned out with varnish just so that they would sit smoother rather than holding every brush stroke and look a little bit more natural. This takes ages because you have to let every layer dry before you put the next one on, so it's 5 minutes of work every day for a week, which is really annoying. But then to finish off, I ended up just using straight red paint to darken the tips and actually give the flames a little bit more shape and definition. The very last step with the flames was to give them a coat of matte varnish to take that weird gloss away from them, because you don't really see reflections of light in a real flame, so matting them down seemed like a sensible idea. In the old lore, one of the major reasons that they think the Firehawks became the Legion of the Damned is because a couple of Legion-ish Marines were found in space coffins, I suppose, along with the burned up chapter banner with a slogan written on it. I decided to use that as the front of my plinth because it seemed like a good finisher. So I threw a banner shape into a digital cutting machine, stuck that onto a piece of foil from a food package, tomato puree if you're really curious, and then cut that out. The bonus of having the paper on it was that it would actually cover up any kind of dints and sharp creases in the banner, but the foil obviously provides it enough weight and stiffness to shape carefully. I did have to paint it with varnish to seal the paper and then sand it down and prime it a couple of times to actually cover up that big square I'd cut out the centre. Hadn't really thought that one through. It was going to be the edging for the centre panel, but it was just way too obvious. I'd sketched up an idea for the banner, so I kind of just copied that, going backwards and forwards, making a little starfield, building the hawk up, using the red from the armour, bordering it with the same yellow that I'd used on the armour, and then kind of backfilling details as I went. I also decided to try and give it some texture by just painting it with lots of little strokes rather than smooth highlights to try and give it an embroidered feel. It looked textured, but it didn't really look embroidered, so I went back with a rigging brush and some thinned down black ink to add horizontal lines across everything and try and tidy up the effect. Eventually I was happy enough with it to let that go, so I could just add the final lettering, which, from the story, was In Dedicato Imperatum Ultra Articulo Mortis, for the Emperor beyond the point of death. Not subtle, but to the point. I figured out which letters needed to be in the middle, and then balanced out the text on either side. Badly, as it turns out, in the case of Imperatum. That's a long word. Then I could just throw some final shading on it and fit it to the front of the plinth. At which point, I called Brother Yorick of the Legion of the Damned. Done.
Okay, so obligatory painter's insecurity to start. I did so much black that the freehand is almost totally gone, probably a bit too much. The flames, I'd planned for them to be more invisible, but when I did the test, I forgot to take into account how much of it I'd add on the final piece. And the lettering on the banner is a little bit off-center in the middle line. But you know what? 3 months ago, I had a test-printed Space Marine head. Now, I have a Firehawk who has gone all the way to Legion of the Damned status. He looks pretty imposing. I'm happy with how he's come out all over. So yeah, gonna call that one a win. And it's making videos like this that kind of pushes me to finish these projects, and even start them in this case. So let me know what you think. Did I go too far? Not far enough? Should I have stopped when he was a Firehawk? Give me a shout down below. And maybe I'll see you next time.